As the Toa once said, unity, duty, and the Bionicle Inspiration series, which is our destiny. Welcome to the Bionicle Inspiration series. This episode, we're going to be covering Black Fantasy MOCs. Now, you may be like, but Ben, what is a Black Fantasy MOC? I've never heard of this before. Or maybe you have heard of it before. But either way, let's have a little bit of a chat about Black Fantasy. So Black Fantasy is a little bit of a theme that was started by a builder known as Nanan. He's a very sort of prominent builder in the system community, and he's been around for quite some time. Black Fantasy was basically sort of created around 2006, and lots of people liked it, and lots of people started to build on it. It's got its own sort of unique, specific kind of style to it, kind of focusing on a color scheme of very heavily black and little highlights of trans neon orange. Overall, it's sort of just this kind of post-apocalyptic, surrealist, kind of dark, edgy fantasy creatures with those specific color schemes. There's also kind of aspects of kind of like creatures and kind of corrupting elements and things like that. Pretty much what you're seeing in the MOC so far is pretty much what sums up any kind of Black Fantasy MOC. And yeah, like I said, Nanan essentially started them, and most of the MOCs that you're currently seeing, in fact, all of the MOCs that you're currently seeing are all made by Nanan himself. So yeah, he made some of the really early Black Fantasy MOCs, and people at conventions started to get on board with it, and it kind of just became a little bit of a movement, kind of became a little bit of a thing. You don't see it too much nowadays, just, I guess, you know, it's kind of old now, 2006 and onwards sort of thing, just less people make it, but every so often you do see some more modern Black Fantasy MOCs. But I think there's some really interesting stuff to note with Black Fantasy as a whole, and it actually relates to kind of the way that CCBS as a theme is moving. So I think there's some really interesting stuff to discuss there. And heck, it's a really beautiful aesthetic and has some really clever, cool stuff going on, and it'd be worth seeing some more stuff from it. So I figured let's do an episode about some Black Fantasy MOCs and see how we can inspire people. So let's keep looking at some of Nanan's Black Fantasy MOCs and just talk about some of the general themes throughout them, like what makes a Black Fantasy MOC. If Nanan's the guy who made them, yeah, what sort of stuff did he do that other people sort of continued on with? Let's have a look at that now. So as we see with a lot of these MOCs that were made by Nanan, a lot of them have various sort of tentacles, tails, droid arms, claws, all sorts of kind of curved, aesthetic looking kind of pieces, things like that, things that look very sort of oozing, tentacle-like, things like that. Also, a lot of the MOCs have played with some really obscure black pieces. You know, we see like a Darth Vader helmet, or all sorts of different, you know, Knights Kingdom Bionicle pieces, all sorts of different stuff like that, which is really cool to see. And especially, too, a lot of them have been used in really unique and creative ways. And as a result, you're able to create some really beautiful, interesting shapes, or get just overall some really interesting stuff out of it as a result. So it's really cool to see. A lot of stuff also sort of seems to be based off of sort of the War for the World's tripod kind of vibes. At least it looks, certain things look sort of close to that. So in a sense, it's almost kind of alien, out of this world, that sort of thing. Certain Black Fantasy MOCs that Nanan has built have various sort of repeated parts on them. Not all the time, but, you know, various tentacles being repeated in lots of ways, or using a whole bunch of pieces in one or two different colors and different ways like that. You know, it works quite well. Also, of course, we see a lot of the trans orange is fairly minimal. It's mainly just sort of on, you know, the eyes. If there's more than one eye, you see a little bit more of it, but typically it's just kind of on the eye, and the rest of the MOC is that monochromatic black. One thing that I think is really interesting on Nanan's stuff, as well as other people who've made Black Fantasy stuff, is there's a really beautiful mesh of both Bionicle and system throughout the MOCs. And I think that's really interesting, because that's certainly the way that Bionicle as a theme is kind of moving. You know, as we have less access to new CCBS parts, people are using more of the new system pieces on their Bionicle MOCs. And so as a result, I think that's just interesting that a lot of Black Fantasy has dealt with that. You see a lot of system builders really playing with Bionicle, and so sort of you can get the inverse here of lots of Bionicle builders playing with using more system into their stuff. So I just think that's really interesting. And that too, you get to play with black, which is a really easy color to use, and a color we have a lot of with CCBS and Bionicle in general. And so, yeah, you're able to kind of get some unique shapes, play with unique black parts, and get some cool stuff out of it, whether it's through Bionicle or system. So I think that's really interesting and really relevant these days, which is great. So let's focus specifically on one of Nanan's MOCs, and then we'll move on to some other MOCs that are Black Fantasy themed that some other people have made. So the first MOC that we have by Nanan is called Patron, a Guardian of the Dark Realm. Now, normally Nanan seems to put some really fun stories in with his Black Fantasy MOC, so this one doesn't have a story, but that's besides the point. And heck, that's always something that's fun to do when you make a MOC, is to write a little bit of a story for it, or just kind of come up with a little bit of a concept. If you're not too much of a writer yourself, there's always different options there. So something of note with this MOC that I really like is kind of just this sort of mesh where the eye is in here. It sort of looks almost kind of geometrical in some ways, kind of forming this really awesome sort of circle and kind of, I don't know, it's just a really unique way of playing with all these different shapes and creating this really nice sort of circular design while still having these sort of almost alien kind of patterns to them. It's really nice to see. And I think that's always something to think about, is to actually play around with pieces and come up with different sort of geometrical shapes and things like that, just to see what you can do. And then as a result, kind of build a mock off of it, which is more or less what this seems to be. That said, I don't know Nanon's exact building process, but, to some degree it could very well be that. So do that, you often see people making table scraps or just sort of playing around with different pieces and making like a hexagon or, some cubes and pyramids and things like that. Just playing around, having fun. Maybe that could actually be something that spawns a mock in itself. And heck, all sorts of geometrical shapes, are pretty much everywhere in the real world and in all art for that matter. So yeah, maybe you can use that as a little bit of a starting point for a future mock. Who knows? Another really cool thing, we've spoken a little bit before about the various tentacles and tail pieces and claws and things like that have been used throughout various Black Fantasy mocks made by Nanon. And one thing I really like about this is just the 3 legs here simply being these very large black tail pieces. They really create this beautiful sort of oozing, organic aesthetic that's very common with Black Fantasy that we've seen so far. And also too, the tail is very minimal. You just simply see those pieces there just being used to make the tails, or well, to make the legs rather. And that's kind of all it needs, so very minimal in parts usage. And for that matter, a lot of Nanon's Black Fantasy mocks have been kind of small as well. Some of them, of course, are a bit bigger, but, size isn't necessarily a problem there. You're able to just kind of play and have fun, which is really cool. So nice work, Nanon. Let's move on to some other mocks by people that have been inspired by Nanon's very cool theme. So the first mock we have is by Brian Kesenovitz and is called Emperor's Garden. So I mentioned a little bit before about sort of more interesting system integrations into things, and I think this is a very nice example of that. Of course, Brian is a more system-based builder, but the actual Black Fantasy monster here uses a very nice amount of Bionicle parts in here. And it's also really cool to see that mixed in with a sort of system diorama base kind of thing. It's creating this really nice sort of post-apocalyptic vibe, really able to get some really interesting stuff with the, the tail kind of seeping out of the ground there and then him bursting out of the ground like that. It's just a really clever way of displaying a mock, so you don't have to build, the whole tail and everything. You can actually put it into a system base like that and get these interesting looks as if it's sort of tunneling through the ground and stuff like that. I think it's really interesting and really, really cool and not too difficult to replicate on your own. And I just think that's something to think about. We've been talking so far a lot in this episode about system integration. That can also extend onto dioramas and landscape to accompany another mock as well. And in some way to kind of add a little bit more to the mock, to present it in a unique way. I think it's really cool. So we see some inverted tires used here. So these are some very large tire pieces, and simply if you actually just turn them inside out, you get this really beautiful, interesting look to them. They look more sort of organic, they look more kind of natural, kind of this oozing Black Fantasy vibe that we've been talking about. And as a result, yeah, it just gets a really nice texture that you can't necessarily achieve in any other way. And also you're really able to kind of shape them in unique ways. You can put whatever you want to form the sort of structure under those tires, and you just kind of place it on the outside there. And yeah, it looks perfect, doesn't it? Very, very cool to see. Also really interesting to note sort of the kind of where the main body ends and the head starts to form. It's sort of this mesh of all these different tentacle pieces, and also some various other Bionicle parts in there, like some Visceract feet and some claws and different things like that. And it's cool how it is just sort of this mesh and mess of different pieces like that, but that really works with this Black Fantasy vibe because it's almost sort of Cthulhu octopus kind of looking, and it looks out of this world, creepy and creature-like and all sorts of different things like that. It's really effective and really works at creating this sort of disturbed alien fantasy kind of vibe, which is very key for Black Fantasy. So it's interesting that you can just essentially kind of make a big mesh of different pieces and things like that, and it still work really effectively and get the point across. Very, very cool. So let's move on to the next mock, which is by Red and is called Black Fantasy Table Scrap. So really interesting choice to sort of build what appears to be this sort of mosquito-like thing. I think that's fantastic and really, really cool to see. It fits very well with the sort of overall aesthetic. It kind of resembles the tripods that we were talking about before to some degree. But there's some very nice stuff going on here. For example, using all these different fishing rod pieces as the legs here works surprisingly well to create this kind of Black Fantasy foot-leg kind of design thing. It looks very tentacle-like. They've got these really interesting tips on the end there where you normally add the string to that fishing rod part. And yeah, it looks very mosquito-like. It looks very Black Fantasy-like. The part itself is kind of easier to bend there, so kind of as everything's resting, they kind of curve a little bit like that. It's just really interesting and looks fantastic. And also works very nicely with these larger aerial pieces there up top that have been used sort of on the behind of this guy. Very, very cool. Some other stuff that's really cool is just the textures on the specific pieces he's used here. Whether it's these Rakshi heads or kind of any Rakshi parts in general, they have these very nice sort of smooth, shiny finishes to them, which naturally looks very kind of alien-like, very Black Fantasy-like, which is really cool. And CCBS pieces in general, any kind of Hero Factory part, like some of the other parts that have been used here on the eye and the back there, again, they sort of have that exact same look, that very organic, smooth, alien kind of vibe to them when used in a correct way. And again, those are very perfect for Black Fantasy. So like I've been saying, kind of just with having a lot of access to CCBS nowadays, it very much lends itself to a Black Fantasy design. So it's pretty perfect to be working on nowadays, in my opinion. Also, a very beautiful part usage here, using this semicircle piece here that has all these sort of hexagon shapes on it. It's very fitting for a kind of alien eye. Looks really, really awesome. Really, really effectively done. I really like it. So let's move on to the next MOC, which is by Johan Dakish, and is called Black Executioner. So something I like about this is it's a very, it's still a Black Fantasy MOC, but it's in a very different direction to the stuff we'd seen before. A lot of the things we'd seen before were very alien, very sort of creature-like, and kind of a little bit more scary. And this MOC is still semi-scary, but it's more humanoid, it's more Toa-like, which is really cool to see. And so it's interesting to note that you can still use that Black Fantasy style, but make it into a Toa, a humanoid, or anything like that. It's more or less just kind of the overall look, the color scheme, that sort of smooth aesthetic, and you've made a Black Fantasy MOC, more or less. So it's cool to see that on a MOC here. So yeah, like I said, using some capes as well as some CCBS parts there, he's really able to get that awesome, smooth, organic Black Fantasy look. But it's really interesting to note that this MOC doesn't use any tentacles at all, which is really interesting and really unique, because tentacles have been very sort of key with all the other MOCs that we've seen so far. But yet this Black Fantasy look is still very much conveyed through this MOC. So I suppose the way that he's done that is using these clawed Ben 10 hand pieces here, as well as creating this almost mustache effect on the mask here by putting those claws on the sides there, as well as just other clawed pieces and the organic textures, everything like I've said before. It creates the Black Fantasy look. But also, just the torso design here, how it kind of thins out and sort of almost kind of divides into two and then returns back into the rest of the chest there. It's just really unique and looks kind of slightly alienish and looks really cool. Very effective, very nicely done. So yeah, I think that's really interesting to see how you can create a very humanoid MOC, but still get that Black Fantasy look in some interesting and different ways. So that's it for some fantastic Black Fantasy MOCs. Like I said, be sure to play around with them, see what you can do. I think very much the way that CCBS is going, it's perfect. It's definitely a right time to be playing around with some Black Fantasy stuff. It's a brilliant aesthetic. So well done to Nanan for making such a really cool theme that a lot of people have responded to in a really positive and awesome way. So nice work. That's it for the episode. Remember now, if you do want to submit one of your own MOCs to the Bionicle Inspiration series, you of course can, but you can only do so through the email address that you are now seeing on screen. It is also available in the description below. Speaking of the description below, be sure to check the description for links to the MOCs that you saw in today's episode, and check out these phenomenal builders because they've all made some fantastic stuff and they deserve some love. So be sure to drop a comment or two on those MOCs and check out some of the other stuff that they've made. Also, while you're there, be sure to check the links in the description to my social media and consider checking out my Patreon page. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Happy building, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.